2 weeks after the Civil War ended, more Americans died on a single Mississippi riverboat than would later die on the Titanic. And almost no one has ever heard of it. The boat was called the Sultana. At 2 in the morning on the 27th of April, 1865, her boilers exploded on the dark river just north of Memphis. She was built to carry 376 people. That night she was carrying more than 2,000. Most of them were soldiers. Union prisoners of war, just released from Confederate camps, finally going home. Around 1,500 of them never arrived. It is still the deadliest maritime disaster in American history. And within days, the country had forgotten it completely. To understand how that is even possible, you have to know exactly what week this was. On the 9th of April, Robert E. Lee surrendered. The war was ending. 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was shot in a theater in Washington. He died the next morning. For the next 2 weeks, the entire country was looking in one direction, the manhunt for the man who killed the president. And on the 26th of April, they found him. John Wilkes Booth was cornered in a Virginia barn and killed. That was the day before the Sultana exploded. So when roughly 1,500 people died on the Mississippi the following night, the newspapers had nothing left. The assassination filled every column. The war filled the rest. The worst ship disaster in the nation's history got a few lines, and then it was gone. But the reason those 1,500 people were on that boat at all is its own kind of scandal. Because they should never have been packed onto a single deck. The men on the Sultana were survivors of Cahaba and Andersonville, the Confederate prison camps. Many of them weighed less than 100 pounds. They had survived starvation, and now they were being sent north, back to their families. The government paid the steamboat companies to carry them. About $5 a head for an enlisted man, more for an officer. Every released prisoner was money. And that changed everything. Because the men were no longer just soldiers going home. They were cargo, and cargo was profit. At Vicksburg, Army officers in charge of the loading funneled prisoner after prisoner onto the Sultana, while other steamboats sat at the same landing and left almost empty. There were accusations of kickbacks, of bribes to fill one particular boat. By the time she pushed off, the Sultana carried more than 2,000 men on a vessel rated for 376. The decks physically bowed under the weight. Officers had to prop them up with beams. She was a disaster before she ever left the dock. And she was hiding a second one, down below the waterline. Days earlier, one of the Sultana's 4 boilers had begun to leak. A boilermaker in Vicksburg examined it and said what needed to be done: 2 metal sheets had to be replaced. That meant days of repair. The captain didn't have days. There was a boat full of paying prisoners and a rival steamer that could take them. So he ordered the shortcut. Instead of replacing the sheets, the crew hammered a thinner patch over the bulge, and the Sultana steamed north. Now put those 2 decisions together. A boiler held closed by a patch. A boat loaded to 6 times its limit. And a spring flood, the Mississippi high, cold and fast, forcing the engines to strain against the current. As the overloaded boat rolled on the bends, water sloshed away from the hot boiler plates and back again. Metal already weakened, already patched, heated and cooled and heated again. At 2 in the morning, north of Memphis, it let go. If a forgotten American history like this deserves to be uncovered, like the video and subscribe. Because what happened in the next 10 minutes is the part the survivors could never forget. 3 of the 4 boilers exploded at once. The blast tore straight up through the center of the ship, through the decks packed with sleeping men. The twin chimneys came down. And within minutes the wooden boat was on fire from the inside out. The men who lived through the explosion faced an impossible choice. Stay on a burning boat, or go into the river. But this was not a calm river. It was in full spring flood, wide, freezing, and running hard in the dark. And the men going into it were the weakest people imaginable, prisoners of war who had been starving weeks earlier, many who couldn't swim, most with nothing to hold on to. Hundreds went into the water at once. They grabbed doors, planks, anything that floated. Some were carried miles downstream. Some pulled each other under simply trying to stay up. It was a resident of Memphis, woken by the glow on the water, who raised the alarm. Boats went out in the dark. At first light, they were still pulling survivors, and the dead, out of the trees along the flooded banks, far below the wreck. Around 1,500 people were gone. And the men who survived had one more thing in common. They had already survived Andersonville. They lived through the worst the war could do to them, and then died coming home. There was an investigation. There always is. A board of inquiry blamed the explosion on too little water in the patched boiler. Fingers pointed at the officers who had overloaded the boat at Vicksburg. One officer was court-martialed and convicted. And then the conviction was thrown out. The quartermaster most tangled in the loading was never punished. The captain had died with his ship. So the deadliest maritime disaster in American history ended the way it began, with no one held responsible. 1,500 men, most of them former prisoners of war, killed by a patched boiler and a boat loaded for profit, and not one person paid for it. The survivors never let it go. For decades they held reunions, smaller every year, trying to keep the memory of the Sultana alive while the rest of the country moved on. They were fighting the same thing that killed the story in the first place. A nation that had just lost its president, and won its war, simply did not have room for 1,500 more dead. The river closed over them twice. Once in the dark, north of Memphis. And once in the history books.